Hello to everyone. Thank you very much for being here. We are at the Podcast Show 2024 with Podcast Magazine, partner, and we also partner with Red Tech, which is a magazine about radio, audio, and digital audio stories that we're running. So every 2 months in a magazine and on a daily website. And Podcast Magazine is in French and is targeting all the podcasters and the podcast lovers and podcast professionals. And today, thanks to Spiritland Studio, as we did last year in French, now we do it in English. I'm very happy to welcome two people that don't know each other and are going to discover each other. And that was the nice thing with this idea of Spiritland Studio, is to be able to record and meet people. So Adam Shefford, you are, I got to know you, and that's what I was telling you just before we started. It feels like I know you already because I passed an hour with you, thanks to Guillaume and his Podcast Guru podcast. So very happy to have you. You are in charge of the British Podcast Awards, but you do a lot of other things. And you had a podcast on a company which is...
Absolutely. So I am part of Haymarket Publishing, which owns the British Podcast Awards and operates a number of other media brands, including various marketing and communications brands, such as Campaign, PR Week, Media Week, and Performance Marketing World. So I'm the head of podcasts for those brands, as well as the editor of the British Podcast Awards. I was also the editor of PodPod for a period of time.
PodPod. And what happened to PodPod? It's still on?
PodPod has been merged into Campaign, which is going to be picking up the events that PodPod was running, as well as the coverage of the audio advertising sector that PodPod was providing. And then on the British Podcast Awards website, we're also doing more of the sort of creator-focused coverage and interviews and that sort of thing through the British Podcast Awards.
So you're not doing news anymore. PodPod was a news website, right?
PodPod was news, features, interviews around the craft and business of podcasting. So we've sort of split that up a little bit. The craft side of things is more under the British Podcast Awards. So we've revamped the British Podcast Awards website, and we're doing a lot of that sort of creative-focused content over there. And then in terms of the business side, that's sitting more under the Campaign brand. So I also publish a monthly audio column in Campaign, and Campaign is kind of investing in more coverage of the audio advertising landscape.
Okay, very nice. Jérémie, Mani, you don't know each other, and the idea is that you also meet, because I thought that it was really interesting to have you meet, because Jérémie, you had the idea 2 years ago to launch a podcasthon. So I don't know if have you heard, Adam, about the Téléthon in France? No.
It rings a vague bell, but I can't say I'm...
Yeah, it's not something that is really famous internationally.
No, it's all started in France, actually in 2023. And it has been extending since then. But the whole idea there is to have a non-for-profit initiative gathering the maximum number of podcasters, hosts of podcasts, and to convince them to dedicate one of the episodes of the show to a charity of their choice, and to release this episode all together in a, let's say, coordinated way. And that's in March. So it started in March 2023 with 300 podcasts coming from France exclusively. And then this current year in 2024, we grew up till over 400 with partners like Acast, Osha, Apple Podcast, Amazon, Spotify, and others.
Yeah, they did playlists to promote all the podcasts that were playing the game.
And we're here to grow internationally, to try to convince as many English-speaking podcasters to join the movement. This is a non-for-profit movement, but to maximize the number of charity, we will have the chance to be invited to a mic, and that's really important for all of the charities.
So it's using podcast on just one episode during a period of a time where they can. So you have to prepare it, a long time in advance. And you publish it during that week, and then there's a whole promotion around it, just for to discover charity organizations and really on a very simple base, which is doing that all together, and it works
create
really
a
well.
mass effect. That's the point. Create a mass effect, have some media coverage, have some partnerships, and to create an atmosphere, a kind of community. During this specific span of 7 days, so many episodes of podcast with a large variety of charities are there and are valuable for listeners.
Yeah. So let's talk about the British Podcast Awards. I mean, this has started a long time ago because podcasting in UK is more mature than in any other European country.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. So the awards started in 2017, and they've been running since then. Haymarket acquired the awards from the original founders, Matt Hill and Matt Deegan, a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Last year was the first year that Haymarket ran the awards sort of from start to finish, and we are gearing up for the second year now. We have actually closed entries for this year. We closed entries last week, so the judges will be starting their deliberation process over the next couple of weeks. And we've also got the Listener's Choice Award, which is a publicly voted category, which will be opening for votes in around 2 weeks.
And which is, they have to choose between all this. How does it work? You have a lot of categories, I saw, and you have judges that are more than 100 judges that are dedicated to certain categories with certain criteria that they have to follow. And the listener's choice is you can vote for all the selected podcasts that every jury has decided, or
so the listener's choice, you can vote for any podcast that you like, UK based, but any UK based podcast that you like. They don't have to enter. They don't have to be shortlisted. It's simply a popularity contest, as it were, and it's just about as a podcaster, it's about you kind of mobilizing your fans and getting your fans out there and getting them to cast their votes for your
okay.
podcast.
So you open that. So any podcast that is UK based can say, you can vote for me.
Yep.
Do they have to request something, to declare something on your website, to register, or you're just a podcast and you say, hey, vote for me, and then they go on the website and you can write the name? But what about if they write the name differently?
So it's linked to the Apple Podcasts
RSS.
database. Yes.
Okay.
So they, there's search functionality, and you go on and find the podcast that you're looking for, and cast your vote. And we'll also be for any podcasts that have submitted an entry to other categories in the British Podcast Awards. We will be supplying podcasters with pre-made sort of social assets and kind of graphics and stuff that they can share on their social media channels.
Okay, so you give them some kind of design stuff so they can promote also as well, and that's automatic, I guess.
Yeah, that's something that we'll be sending out to podcasters.
Yeah, because if you have 1,000 podcasts doing it, I mean, you can't do a design for every of them.
No, it'll be sort of a sort of template-based design, but it'll be personalized for each podcast.
Yeah, that's a lot of work. So what do you think about the idea about the Podcasthon?
I think it's a fabulous idea. We've seen from a number of charity organisations and sort of charity figures in the UK, we've heard that podcasts are actually a really underutilised tool for charities in the UK. It's a fabulous vehicle for getting your message across. It's a really emotive medium, and the barrier to entry in terms of the investment that you need to actually produce content is much, much lower than video content in particular. And you can, whether that's appearing on somebody else's podcast that's already established, or launching your own podcast as a charitable organization around your sort of, cause or a subject that you're particularly sort of invested in as an organization. It's actually a really valuable way to reach those audiences in a low cost but high impact way. And I would like to see more charities making use of it.
Can I add something on
Sure.
that? we realized with yours, I don't know if you share this view, but that probably podcast is not the best tool to raise money, because there are a lot of other means to do that, with like auctions, marathons, I don't know, calls-ins, you name it. But probably the best to bring awareness, to convey emotions, to connect people with a potentially larger audience. And that's what we're trying to do with this podcasting, to enlarge a circle of supporters for the charities. And they all have to connect with new potential donors, new potential volunteers, new people that would be genuinely interested in what they're doing. And if you spend 30 minutes, 1 hour listening carefully to an episode talking about what this charity has done, and with the talent of the podcaster too, the host is able to ask appropriate questions, to have a good storytelling, then you memorize the message of the charity, and there's better chance that in the future you will become, let's say, a supporter, could be a donator, could be a volunteer.
And we noticed this year that we created a committee, editorial committee, with some actors, because the first year, Jérémie and Yves just started the stuff, from nowhere, right, from Canada and Lille. So, no one knew where they were coming from. They're not from the industry. They're not known at all. But so the network that started in France to be more and more powerful wondered who. So we made that little committee, and now some ideas came out from that committee with new network gathering different podcasts and promoting the whole podcast with a certain organization, and it gave a lot of ideas to podcasters and to production companies to also look at podcasts differently and use their podcast in a sense that they were not thinking about before. And that's also very interesting, the feedback that we got this year from network, Jérémie.
There's a lot of very interesting stories. For sure, it started from scratch, but this year there was kind of creativity unleashed, and first I have to say that everyone is welcome. There are some hosts with very large audience and some niche podcasts, and everyone is welcome. But including all of this family, some of them were really creative this year. I can give the example of a network gathering 12 different podcasts with the same theme of education interests, and they made a single episode, released 12 times in the 12 different community networks, but a single episode with 12 voices, and was really creative to fight against bullying. So it was really interesting. This episode had been listened to 400,000 times so far. It's quite an interesting number, and it was really efficient in terms of message conveyed to fight against this specific cause, against this bullying. So that was one example of creativity, and there are so many other examples. I do love the energy coming from this event. All the podcasters, once a year, they feel that they are part of a bigger community, bigger than themselves. They are really creative in their stories, on social networks. They are encouraging themselves. Hey, I've seen your episode, it's great, but you'll see my guests tomorrow. I will release tomorrow. You'll see, you will be happily surprised. And I love this energy. Podcasters, you're right to say we are not part of this family, at least originally. And I have to say that podcasters are great. I have frequented a lot of different communities in the digital industry, and very
passionate people,
and with and I would say committed people too.
Yeah,
for most of them.
How is it with the indie podcast industry? Because your British Podcast Awards are targeted towards how we call them native podcasts in France. We get a special name because we're French, but it's like first podcast. That's the podcast that can really enter your awards. Can they be replay from radio stations or?
Absolutely.
So you accept any kind of podcast, even like podcasts that started on YouTube?
Yes, the only sort of technical requirements is that they have to be available on RSS.
They need to have a feed, RSS feed, but you don't care if it's if it has been broadcast first on radio and then no matter.
Not
It's
at all.
just the story that
100%. Especially in the UK, we have a really strong sort of broadcast radio, industry, a really strong broadcast radio tradition. A lot of the really great podcasts that we have in this country have come through the BBC.
Yeah.
A lot of them sort of started as radio shows and sort of have become podcasts. A lot of them are sort of built as podcasts first and foremost, but also broadcast, over the air. In fact, there's one really interesting example of how that sort of works in practice. There is a radio DJ, John Kennedy, who does a podcast called Tape Notes, but he also does a music podcast. And as I'm sure many podcasters are aware, the sort of issue of music licensing and sort of music rights and making sure that you've got all the sort of necessary copyright permissions and everything to be able to play kind of commercial music in a podcast is something that there's still a lot of uncertainty around for podcasting. So the way John Kennedy and Global, which is the sort of radio company that he produces the podcast for, the way they get around that is they put the podcast out on a radio station in Manchester at like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. But it goes out on the radio, and they know then that they've got all the rights payments and licenses and everything sorted, because they know how to do it in radio. They know how it works. They've got all the sort of agreements kind of that just keep rolling. And so they put it out on the radio, but it's billed as a podcast. It's promoted as a podcast.
So you use the production tools of radio stations. And it's like in France, if you have a radio station and you broadcast your program, you have the SACEM, which is the right management for the music,
yes,
and everything that is paid. And if you do that in podcast, you don't have to pay anything because it's included into your fee, your global fee. So that's pretty smart. And the idea, and I was talking about with Adam Curry and through Benjamin Bellamy from Castopod, which is an open source hosting company, and he made an interview of Adam Curry, and Adam Curry we asked him, can we have a tag in the RSS feed, RSS 2.0, about if it's a native or a podcast first, and he said, we don't care. I mean, a podcast is a podcast. If you use RSS, whether it comes from video, it doesn't matter. What we want is it's the listeners that is choosing. We don't care if it's
from a listener point of view. There's no difference.
Yeah.
Probably.
No, exactly. So it's true that I think it's a fight in France and in Canada as well, in Quebec a lot. A lot of people are fighting for native podcasts, but I think it's because we're not mature yet in the market. So we don't have examples of native podcasts that went be beyond what the radio industry is able to do today. But radio industry has so much power in promoting their podcast through their own air and their network and their big market, in magazines and live in the streets. So it's really hard to get noticed when you're a native podcast. So that's why we want to call it native. But I think it's going to fade away pretty soon. And I think it's right that you can accept any kind of audio as soon as it is in a RSS feed.
Yes.
And then does it have to be produced in a period of time?
Yes.
Do you need a certain amount of episodes?
Yes, so you need 6 episodes, at least 6 episodes, published in the eligibility window, which I'm not 100% certain off the top of my head, but I believe it's June last year to the sort of start of the entry period this year, which...
So you basically have 8 months or something like that?
More or less. It's around a year.
And so it's the creation of the podcast needs to be within that period, or the last episode of.
Just you need to have produced at least 6 episodes and published them within that window. So you can have launched a new podcast in that time, or you can submit, your podcast that's been running for, years and years.
Okay.
Can I ask a question to Adam? I was very curious to know how many voters in the public are participating to this public vote, and how many podcasts are collecting at least one vote. Is that public figures?
So in terms of the number of voters, I believe last year we had 200,000 votes cast. And in terms of the number of podcasts that got sort of 1 or 2 votes, it is quite a lot that got like less than 5 votes, just because of the way that the statistics work. But there's around 100 that got sort of at least sort of, I think I'm right in saying there is around 100 that got 1,000 votes or more.
Okay, so so just so I understand, you have if you start a podcast, you need to have 6 episodes in that window, and then you can publish. If you have 5, you can't.
Yes.
And then if you have a podcast, a daily podcast that goes on since, I don't know, for 5 years, each year you can participate again.
Absolutely.
And then after you have, how many, do you select an amount of episodes for each category that are kind of nominated?
So the way it works with the submissions is we require an audio submission, which is between 3 and 5 separate clips, up to 15 minutes in total.
Okay, so you don't have the whole podcast. They have to make a work.
Yes, correct.
Which is a selection.
Absolutely.
Of 15 minutes, and inside of those 15 minutes.
So it's between 3 and 5 clips, up to a maximum of 15 minutes. So generally around sort of, 2 to 3 minutes per clip, roughly. And then alongside that, there is also a written entry that goes along with that, basically giving sort of more information on your podcast, the context around it, why you think you should win that particular category. And the judges will look at both the audio submission and the written submission.
And you did three clips because it's important for a judge to have at least 3 pieces.
Yes,
to listen to.
Yeah, there are a couple of exceptions around certain categories like fiction and interview where we also allow one sort of longer clip.
Okay.
But in general, we feel that a selection of multiple clips gives entrants the opportunity to really showcase a sort of a range of different kind of moods and tones and moments.
That means that in those clips, in those 3 clips, 3 to 5 clips, they can edit, or they have to be the audio in the clip that is not edited.
It's got to be unedited audio for each clip.
That's smart.
Yeah. There's no, we don't allow any sort of transitions or any edits or anything like that.
Or any added
stuff
to say, hey, I'm thank you for the British Podcast Award. We're very happy to. Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Nice. So nominated, you have nominations. How many? Like 3, 5, and then there's a short list, or how does it work?
So
you have more than 1,000 podcasts that are, and they have to pay each of them.
Yes. So we have a sort of sliding scale of entry fees, kind of tiered pricing, based on company size. We also have an early bird pricing window, which kind of gives sort of smaller independent podcasters an opportunity to lock in a sort of lower price if they can get their entries in kind of ahead of the sort of bulk of the window. So how it works is that once all the entries come in, we will pass those entries on to our initial stage judging panel, who will go through and sort of weed out ones, for example, that don't meet the entry criteria, ones that are just not up to standard, and they'll be kind of whittling down that list into the sort of the long list, effectively. That will then go over to our main stage judges, who will do their deliberations, give their scores in their respective categories, and then we will have a sort of an overall judging day where our main stage judges will decide the winners in each category from the shortlist. So the shortlist is generally around sort of 5 to 7 podcasts per category, mostly.
But do you announce them?
Yes.
The 5-7 that are selected, that are nominees?
Yes, absolutely.
And then you invite them to the show?
Yeah, so we'll have the ceremony itself, which is on the 26th of September at London's Outernet venue, and that will be the opportunity for the nominees and the judges and sort of industry luminaries to come together and really celebrate those winners.
So when you're nominee, you're invited, and if not, you have a ticket entry for people that want to be there, or partners, of course, because you need to finance all that.
Absolutely. So we do reserve places for particularly in the Rising Star category, and then we have ticketed entry for kind of other companies in the industry and so on and so forth. And tickets will be going on sale in the next sort of couple of months.
Okay, cool. How many? I had a question, I forgot it. That's typical. But it's great because have you looked at some other awards that were existing, or do you make the awards evolving? I mean, do you change categories? Do you change criteria every year, or is it almost always the same?
It's usually more or less the same. It has evolved over the years. So, we've added certain categories, we've taken away other categories as they sort of become less relevant. This year, for example, we have a best host category, which we didn't up to now. And we'll kind of fine tune the entry criteria and whatnot as the industry evolves and as the medium evolves.
Out of those 25 categories, or
26 if memory serves.
26, and maybe one with Podcasthon soon. But out of those 25 categories, how many winners are indies?
It varies year to year.
They have the same chance then?
Absolutely. The way the industry works, certainly in the UK, is that the indie sector is really thriving, and the indie sector is part of what makes podcasting such a rich and vibrant medium. We frequently have indies and smaller podcasts making up big chunks of the shortlist and big chunks of the winners from year to year. What generally tends to stand sort of established podcasts in good stead, or podcasts from established organizations rather, is that established organizations, media publishers, podcast networks, broadcasters, so on and so forth, is these organizations have, marketing departments that have people whose, part of whose job is to write awards entries year after year for multiple different award schemes. And it's a skill. It's a skill that takes practice to sort of develop a sense of what judges are looking for and the kind of language that can sell sort of a project as part of that. And, independent podcasters usually don't have those kinds of skill sets because their skill sets are in actually producing the content. And that, to be honest, is the biggest thing that independent podcasters could do to improve their chances. It's not about the content, because the content is fantastic. The content stands on its own and, is absolutely the equal of the sort of established broadcasters and
the quality is also, and that's what radio station that has been producing shows for a long time now in Radio France, France Inter, all those stations. They have now competitors which are really strong and which are often as good as a production with 10 people.
Absolutely.
So it's really amazing to see that, and it's good. It's refreshing as well, and it's a competition for a radio station, but it's also a tool to be able to go and get some new talent, because that's also the goal of the British Podcast Award, or Podcast Awards in general.
Absolutely.
Is for stations or for audio actors to
spot new talent.
To spot new talents and to spot new stories and to have new ideas that
voices,
new voices. So it's really interesting. Right? Do you have any question, Jérémie, to Adam?
Well, Adam, I would be really pleased to have your input and maybe offline, but your advice also on how a French-speaking initiative can spread out in the UK world and try to gather as many podcasters as we can. I'm convinced that there's the same kind of wish to help charities. So really happy to have your connections, advice, tips, whatever you can give. It's always useful. We're here to connect with as many people as we can. And we're a small non-profit organization, so we really rely on all the handful hands that we can find on our way.
All right. So if you want to have some information about Podcasthon, there's a website.
There's a website with one pager in English, and the rest will be shortly translated. So that's Podcasthon, THON at the end, .org, as simple as that, and you will find any kind of information that you need. We also have an Instagram account, Podcasthon /EN, so like English, and we also have any kind of information, testimonial, example, a lot of things.
The British Podcast Awards, it's too late to participate. You have a lot of participation that comes, you need to be UK based, or you need to be addressing UK.
So either. Obviously, you can enter if you are UK based. If you are producing content that is predominantly aimed at a UK audience, but you're not yourself based in the UK, that also will qualify you.
Yeah, because there's a lot of podcasts. I mean, Podcast Guru, the guy in the UK and again in France. So how it's kind of, and how do you know that it's targeting UK? Because, for instance, Podcast Guru is not really targeting you. It's targeting the whole world. And that's the tricky thing with the English language.
Yes.
So this is really touchy. And if they enter and they pay for the entry and you don't select them, do you refund or not?
So generally speaking, that'll be on a case-by-case basis, and it will be that's where we rely on sort of the initial stage judges to sort of make those kinds of calls and sort of flag any podcasts that they feel maybe are ineligible for entry, and then we'll sort of look at those on a case-by-case basis. And if it's a case like that where it's sort of it's not specifically and really clearly looking at sort of UK audiences, UK based topics, issues, whatever that might be, then we will sadly have to disqualify that.
Yeah, so no US podcast, and unless they talk only about things that happens about in UK or about UK.
Yeah, pretty much.
Cool. Okay, that's very interesting. So to have more information about the British Podcast Awards, you just Google it, or you have the website, I guess.
So you can go to britishpodcastawards.uk to find out more information about the awards, interviews with judges, previous winners, and you can head to britishpodcastawards.com to submit your entry, which you can't do anymore, sadly.
No,
but to to check out the shortlists when those are available, and to buy tickets for the awards when those go on sale later this year.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. This is the end of this great session with Adam Shefford and Jérémie Mani. Very happy to have talked with you with podcastmagazine.fr and redtech.pro for those who wants to read some nice stories about radio, digital audio and podcasting. Thank you very much for thank you to the Spiritland Studio as well for this opportunity to use this studio at the podcast show 2024, which was interesting. Did you just to finish? You see some interesting things at the podcast show. What is the one or two things that really you noticed and that struck you?
So the podcast show this year feels much more business focused, feels much more professional than last year, which is very interesting. And I've spent most of my time at the show so far, running into old friends and contacts and whatnot. But I did manage to catch Mark Asquith from Captivate, his session yesterday on myth-busting podcast growth strategies, which was very enlightening. Some home truths for the industry, I think.
Yeah, I heard also that there was some companies there that were selling some listeners, fake listeners. That's another thing. Something that struck you at the podcast show?
That was our first time, so I can't compare, but I love the energy everywhere in the booth and in the conference, and for sure we'll be back.
Yeah, I noticed one thing for myself, which is I noticed that I was talking to Jérémie about it just this morning, that the number of exhibitors that re-exhibited from last year is very low. It's a lot of new exhibitors, and it's almost more than 50% of the exhibitors that are not the same as last year. So that's kind of surprising.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. That means either that it's more business and they just come for the business and not really for to be discovered. And there's new companies that comes to be discovered. So it's a business that really rolls a lot, because usually in exhibition it's 70 to 80% of exhibitors that comes back.
Yeah.
If the industry is really stable. So it's also maybe a kind of industry which moves a lot, which can be good or not. We'll see that in a few years. Whatever, podcasting is really interesting to have guys like you to make things happen. Very happy to be with you. Thank you very much, and have a nice end of podcast show.
Thank you for having us.
Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you, Philippe.